already talked about the major changes in life circumstances, that indeed the negative events have a bigger impact. And of course, the larger the event is, and the more common it occurs, more often it occurs. So again, that unresolved conflict, if a person is not ready or able to take a behavioral change, you will justify it. You will try to justify the action because it makes you feel better or less guilty. For example, I know someone who used to work in, they use the fancy word in England, abattoir. I think that's the word they use, which means slaughterhouse. Yeah. Anyway, so I remember he said that, oh, well, animals don't have feelings at all, which is any psychologist, any scientist we all know it's pretty obvious. Anybody with a pet, it's obvious they do, and it's well researched from neuroscientists of Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness to on and on and on. But anyway, but he really was determined, I think for his own peace of mind. And, I give him a big virtual hug because, I think, he's a normal guy and he needed to earn money while he was in college or whatever. And so he worked at this job. So I feel sad for the workers too, because they have to work out this conflict. So I felt bad for him, but to help him his own self sleep at night, he convinced himself that they don't have feelings. And you'll see that a lot. I also have a colleague who did her PhD on people who do animal testing, and they would handle their own conflicted emotions in a similar way. It's like, oh, they don't feel, monkeys don't feel. I mean, clearly that's way off the mark, but to sleep at night, it helps a person when they say it and they convince themselves. So that's important to know. Anytime, even a goal though, even let's go away from cognitive dissonance, even things that are two goals, you want both, so even something in the future and deciding, on these things that might conflict. There might be a situation where your parent wants you to major in one thing and your heart wants to major in psychology. I've had students with that conflict who had a couple last year who majoring in business. They went there because their parents wanted them to, but their heart didn't want to do that, and so they switched to psychology. And so they were finally able to, I think, work it out with their parents and have I think the parent at least wanted them to try, so you can, maybe some of you were in that situation. So we can come upon these throughout our lives with lots of circumstances. So yeah, continuing post-traumatic stress disorder. So these are some of the symptoms. Sometimes you see the symptoms right away. Sometimes they show up later. Sometimes it's only they show up during a trigger. So say if you were in a war situation and you were in a terrible situation where there was gunshot. So every time you hear fireworks, for example, it might trigger that traumatic response. And and also same thing happens, and it sounds quite similar. There's actually some places where they're trying to outlaw at least fireworks that have the sound, because animals also get really scared. I mean, how do you know? How do you explain to them that this is a fake? This isn't something that will kill you. We've evolved to be afraid of loud sounds for a good reason, because usually super loud sounds can be harmful. Anyway, other effects can be that you have nightmares, that you have trouble sleeping, that you are detached from your emotions, that you don't even let yourself experience the emotion. I guess I'll stay with, because I do also research on people who work with animals. So another situation was a man who, and again, I think he was a good guy, which I think is all the more why it brought him so much pain. But he had you know, again, kind of with family background, you know, he came into a family, had pig farms, etc. He had a little pig farm, but in order to compete with the factory farms, he had to start to treat his own little farm like a factory farm to kind of rev up production. So then he put them in these little pens and stacked them on top. And it was just, you know, miserable for him, but he cut off his emotions in order to deal with it. And he was actually, when he was interviewed, a very large man. And I probably masked his emotions through eating, whatever, and he just had zero facial expression. And as we know, remember the experiment we talked about in the emotion section, where when people saw a disturbing video, this was an experiment, they saw a disturbing video, but they were told to not show emotion, that their heart rate, their physiological stress response increased because they were holding in a natural expression. So this poor guy was cut off. Plus, you don't want to feel, right? Sometimes when people do self-harm, it's because they want to feel. They've learned to cut off their emotions because life is too painful. So this guy cut off his emotions. And the reason I'm also glad to tell you this story is because later he did change his behavior. He couldn't stand it anymore. So he turned his farm into a sanctuary. And so the rest of the pigs became, you know, saved, you know, his friends basically, and he used his land for plants. And when he was interviewed years later, he was slim, he was joyful, he was like a totally different person. Amazing. So anyway, so I'm very passionate about, you know, people happiness. I don't want anybody to be sad.